Okay, as I mentioned yesterday, this is a crucial time in American history, and so this is 70-some pages of my notes, and it will result in 2 exams, and so it's pretty big. So we need to really be keying in. If you're going to be gone for things like FCCLA on Wednesday or whatever else we're doing, make sure you get on the notes and get them done so you have them done before you come back, because this is a sequence day-by-day process. So we'll start over and talk about October 14th and 15th of 1962 to kind of set up the Cuban Missile Crisis. We mentioned yesterday that the crisis involved the 2 most powerful countries in the world, the United States of America and the Soviet Union, which meant that it also involved the 2 most powerful leaders in the world, which would be President Kennedy of the United States and Nikita Khrushchev of the Soviet Union. Now, the crisis actually begins on Sunday, October 14th, 1962. Now, this is really not considered one of the 13 days in October. This is when it sets up. And what happened on that date is that Air Force Major Richard Heiser left Edwards Air Force Base in California in his U-2 spy plane. And what he did is at 7:31 a.m. that morning is he crossed the coastline of Cuba, and it took him about 12 minutes to photograph that island in a normal run. It was just a normal spy run, so to speak. So he runs his mission in 12 minutes. He lands in southern Florida. He turns over the film from his photographs over to members of the CIA. By Monday, November 15th, they had taken those photographs to Washington, D.C. at CIA headquarters, and they developed those pictures. And when they looked at the pictures on Monday, October 15th, they were very shocked with what they saw in the photographs. Now, several men studied those photographs from the CIA, including a fellow by the name of Michael Davis. And Davis reported that he thought the photographs clearly showed long circular objects that measured somewhere between 65 feet and 100 feet in length. That's what he took off the photographs. Another one of the men who studied the photographs was Dino Bruganoni, and he determined that these long circular objects that measured between 65 feet and 100 feet were actually Soviet SS-4, and those were medium-range ballistic missiles. And he also determined by looking at those and doing some research on those missiles that they had a range of about 2,000 miles, which meant from Cuba, those missiles could strike every major city in the United States with the exception of Seattle, within that range. Well, the next person to interpret the photographs was Art Lundahl. He was the director of the CIA's National Photographic Interpretation Center, and he studied the photographs, and he turned to both Davis and Bruganoni, and he said, quote, "This is trouble, real trouble." They knew they had a problem there. So what the CIA realized at that point is that the Soviet Union was supplying communist Cuba with ballistic missiles that were capable of targeting every major city in the United States with the exception of Seattle. So they had some information. Now that took us to Tuesday, October 16th, which was really the first day of what we call the 13 days of October that is documented in history, and that's written about in the book that Robert Kennedy later wrote. And so October 16th, 1962 was the official beginning of 13 days as we know it. What happened is at 9 o'clock that morning of the 16th, President Kennedy called his brother Bobby. He asked Bobby to come to the White House. When Bobby got to the White House, President Kennedy filled him in with the early information that he had received, and he also told Bobby that they would be briefed by the CIA on the situation later that morning. Well, at 11:45 a.m. that day of October 16th, Marshal Carter of the CIA arrived at the White House, and he gave a formal presentation on the situation in Cuba to President Kennedy and several members of his cabinet. Basically, Carter told Kennedy about the presence of the missiles, and he also mentioned the missile launching pads, which we talked about yesterday. Fortunately for the United States, these missile launching pads were not operational, which meant they were not ready to actually launch the missiles. So it's going to be crucial that the United States acts before these launching pads become operational. Now, obviously, everybody involved in that discussion after Carter's presentation believed the United States is in great danger. We are only 99 miles from Key West, Florida to Cuba. Obviously they have the range to shoot 2,000 miles. We're in a bad situation. So seeking help to explore what options he might have about this problem in Cuba, Kennedy organizes a committee. And this committee would consist of selected members of his cabinet, not all members, ones he personally selected. It would also have selected leaders of the United States Armed Services, military leaders that he would select personally, not all of them, but ones he would select. And then he was going to look outside the box at some other influential government leaders that might be able to shed some light or have some expertise on this subject. And so he put together this committee, which the official name, and I wrote it up here because it's not on your ID sheet, the official name of this committee that Kennedy put together was the Executive Committee of the National Security Council, but it's better known in U.S. history as ExCom. And you really will not hear too much about Executive Committee of the National Security Council, you'll hear ExCom. So when they're talking about ExCom, they're talking about this committee. So what we're going to do today is tell you exactly who Kennedy chose to be on this ExCom committee. And these people are going to be people you're going to need to know, and we have several of them up on the board that I'll talk to you about. Now we mentioned yesterday, a lot of these names are going to be familiar. Obviously he's going to have the Secretary of Defense. I believe Emily said that yesterday. So Robert McNamara, Secretary of Defense, is going to be on this committee without doubt. So he'll be one member of the committee. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara. And these are people we've talked about, notables in Kennedy's cabinet. He also is going to include, obviously, as Secretary of State, who is going to be Dean Rusk. So Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara and Secretary of State Dean Rusk are obvious choices that he'll have on this ExCom committee. He also is going to include who? Who's second in command? Bobby Kennedy, some people think, but who is? Vice President Lyndon Johnson. So Vice President Lyndon Johnson also is going to be a member of the ExCom committee, although I'll tell you, he didn't have much say in it. He really didn't have much say in it. But he needed to be there because for some off reason that something might happen to the President, you certainly would need to have the Vice President in the loop. Okay? He also included his Secretary of the Treasury, C. Douglas Dillon. He included his Secretary of the Treasury. Why might he include his Secretary of the Treasury? Because really that guy's job is to deal with financial matters, and this isn't going to have a ton to do with finances, is it? So why might he include C. Douglas Dillon? Well, maybe, but it really doesn't have to do with finances. Why might he put him on that committee? Because he valued his opinion and trusted him. Okay? Another person he had on the committee, obviously, was the Attorney General Robert Kennedy, who will turn out to be really his closest advisor in this whole thing. So he includes the Attorney General Robert Kennedy. Who else might you include?
Question.
Yeah.
Were there a lot of other presidents who had a lot of family relations in office like Kennedy did, or is Kennedy kind of?
He's kind of the anomaly.
Okay.
Yeah. Who else might he have on there? Who was McGeorge Bundy? Does anybody remember McGeorge Bundy when we talked about the President's Cabinet? Here he is right here, McGeorge Bundy. He was the National Security Advisor. Absolutely you would have him in there. So McGeorge Bundy also would be part of the ExCom. So you've got your Secretary of State, Dean Rusk, you've got your Secretary of Defense, Robert McNamara, you've got your Secretary of the Treasury, C. Douglas Dillon, you've got the Vice President, Lyndon Johnson, you've got the Attorney General, Robert Kennedy, and now you've got the National Security Advisor, George Bundy. Somebody else said this yesterday. Who else might they have? Member of the what? CIA. And the CIA director at this time was John McCone. Remember, he was the guy that replaced Allen Dulles when he was fired. So John McCone, CIA director, was also involved. Now think about people we've talked about, because the rest of these people we're going to get into you haven't heard of. Who is somebody else he might have in there that might be kind of a wise old hat? Good politician. People trust him. We've talked about him lots of times. Really a good guy, and really he's going to be a key member of this whole thing before it's over. Who?
Wasn't Adlai Stevenson?
Very good, Braden. Very good. Adlai Stevenson. He now was the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations. Kennedy appointed him U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, which means he's the guy and goes and speaks for the United States at any United Nations meeting. And this is going to be a big United Nations deal before it's over. So Adlai Stevenson also is part. And again, at this time, he's the U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations. Okay? Who else might you get? Because you're probably going to have to give a few talks and have to make some public appearances. His speechwriter. Who was that? Anybody remember? Who was presidential speechwriter and advisor? Theodore Sorensen. So people that you've heard of. Dean Rusk, Secretary of State. Robert McNamara, Secretary of Defense. C. Douglas Dillon, Secretary of the Treasury. Lyndon Johnson, Vice President. Robert Kennedy, Attorney General. McGeorge Bundy, National Security Advisor. John McComb, CIA Director. Adlai Stevenson, who now serves as U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations, and Kennedy's presidential speechwriter and advisor, Theodore Sorensen. Those are people you've heard of. Now, what other people is he going to have on that committee we talked about yesterday? We talked about today? Military people. Okay, does anybody know what the Joint Chief of Staff is in our military? If you're the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff, first of all, what's the Joint Chief of Staff? Okay, who's the overall commander of American forces? The President. The guy second in command, or it could be a gal, is the Joint Chief of Staff. In other words, one military branch is designated as the Joint Chief of Staff. It might be the Air Force, it might be the Marines, it might be the Army, it might be the Marines. At this time, the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff was General Maxwell Taylor, and he was an Army general. So my point is that the Army controlled the second in command past the Commander-in-Chief. If something happened to the Commander-in-Chief and a military decision had to be made, the Army was the Joint Chief of Staff at this point. So the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff is the highest ranking military officer right under the President, and in this point it was General Maxwell Taylor. So General Maxwell Taylor is on the ExCom Committee, and he's the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. In other words, again, the Army's in charge. They're the head military organization during Kennedy's administration, and Maxwell Taylor is the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, which means that he is in charge, second command, so to speak, to the President. Okay, he also grabbed the Chief of Staff from the United States Air Force. Why would he grab the Air Force? Do you think there's a good chance the Air Force could be used in this operation to get this taken care of? Absolutely. So he grabbed the Chief of Staff of the United States Air Force, which was General Curtis LeMay. So the Chief of Staff of the United States Air Force. What's that tell you? He's the top dog in what branch of the military? Air Force. Okay, it is General Curtis LeMay. So he's got the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Maxwell Taylor, and he's also got the highest ranking officer in the Air Force, which is Curtis LeMay. He also grabs the Chief of Naval Operations, the head of the Navy, and that would be Admiral George W. Anderson, Jr. George W. Anderson, Jr. So he's covered his bases. He's got the overall commander of American forces, and the chairman of the Joint Chief of Staff in General Maxwell Taylor. He's got the head of the Air Force in General Curtis LeMay. He's got the head of Naval Operations in Admiral George W. Anderson. And he also is going to pick a guy by the name of General Walter Sweeney. And Sweeney is the commander of U.S. Tactical Air Command. And I'll repeat that. Okay, Walter Sweeney, who's the commander of the U.S. Tactical Air Command. So who does he work for? What branch? Air Force. But he's the head of air strikes, basically, of the Tactical Air Command. He's the guy ahead of airplanes that are going to make, bombing missions or strike force. So you have General Walter Sweeney, commander of the U.S. Tactical Air Command. You have Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral George W. Anderson. You've got Curtis LeMay, who's the Chief of Staff of the United States Air Force. And you have Maxwell Taylor, who's the overall commander. Here's a picture of George Anderson right here. Okay, this is the guy, Admiral Anderson. Now, what type of person are we missing? We've got members of Kennedy's cabinet. We've got military leaders. What are we missing? He's kind of got it in Adlai Stevenson. Other experts. He picks a guy by the name of Dean Acheson, who's on your ID sheet. And here's Dean Acheson right here. This is Dean Acheson. And he had a key reason for picking him, because does he look like a guy that is a young, inexperienced politician type fella? No, he looks pretty seasoned. He was former Secretary of State under President Truman. And Kennedy really wanted him on this committee. Because what would he give? Expertise and an old-fashioned way of looking at things. This Cold War went on during the Truman administration, right? And it went on during the Eisenhower administration. And Acheson served in the cabinets of those two fellows, and he wanted somebody with some expertise in the old way of doing things. Because after all, he just got criticism for him being young and inexperienced, and he already screwed up the Bay of Pigs, right? So he wants somebody that's going to give him the old-fashioned version. So the final member of XCom that has any really position is Dean Acheson. So let's just go through and make sure. We got one left, though, and this one I haven't told you yet will be as important as Bobby Kennedy in this deal. So we got Secretary of State Dean Rusk, Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara, Secretary of the Treasury C. Douglas Dillon, Vice President of the United States Lyndon Johnson, Attorney General Robert Kennedy, National Security Advisor McGeorge Bundy, CIA Director John McComb, U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations Adlai Stevenson, Presidential Speechwriter and Advisor Theodore Sorensen, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff Army General Maxwell Taylor, Curtis LeMay, General Curtis LeMay, Chief of Staff of the United States Air Force, General Walter Sweeney, Commander of the U.S. Tactical Air Command of the Air Force, Admiral George W. Anderson, Jr., Chief of Naval Operations, and former Secretary of State under President Truman, Dean Acheson. We have one more member, and this particular member is going to be as important as Bobby Kennedy. How's it going?
Imagine you talking about the Kennedys.
It just happened.
Never saw it coming.
So,
A bit of a fixation.
Yeah, impress Mr. Nicholson. Tell me, what guy in the background that Kennedy really trusts other than his brother is he going to put on XCOM, who really holds a real minimal position at this time? Real minimal, but has a lot of power.
Glenn kind of lit up there.
Come on.
No, you look right at me, you kind of lit up.
He's on the wall over here, and I've talked about him as being a very important ally to the president.
So one of the guys who created a position?
What's that? Who was the guy he created a position for? Irish fellow. I'm gonna let, okay.
Oh, Lawrence O'Brien.
You're close. He has an O in it. Come on! Make my day. You can look at your notes, there's no law against it. Kenneth O'Donnell. Kenneth O'Donnell.
Okay, one quick question
Yeah.
for Mauricio. Mauricio, point at the picture of Casey Tibbs.
You know, I had that up here one time.
Mauricio. And don't act like you don't know who that is. Raise your hand if you know who Casey Tibbs is, because that's, you should know this. Taylor, don't act like you can't see me.
I don't know who it is.
Tell him.
That's what's wrong with America if you don't know who Casey Tibbs is.
I had him up here one time. Right, pasted right here.
Really?
Yeah, tell him. We gotta learn something new every day.
The all-time greatest bronc rider who ever lived. How can you not know that?
That could be a good extra credit question on the test. Casey Tibbs, you better write that down.
Mauricio, if you dress like Casey Tibbs one time this year, I'll give you $100. But you gotta Google what he looked like. It's $100. That'd be worth it, wouldn't it?
You bet it would. You'd have to get a haircut. So Kenneth O'Donnell. Now, I'm going to tell you a little bit about Kenneth O'Donnell. And the reason why you need to know about Kenneth O'Donnell is because when we watched the movie 13 Days, which is awesome, he's a key player, and he is in this whole thing. So you need to, why in the world would Kennedy pick his appointment secretary to be on this committee? Well, I'm going to tell you a little bit about him. First of all, O'Donnell is Kennedy's top aide. Other than his brother, he's the man that he trusts more than anyone. So he is Kennedy's top aide. He likes David Powers, he likes Lawrence O'Brien, and he trusts them. But Kenneth O'Donnell is his #1 advisor and the man he trusts second only to his brother. Now, Kenneth O'Donnell was actually born Patrick Kenneth O'Donnell. Well, if I tell you, I know it. He was actually born Patrick Kenneth O'Donnell. And his dad was the head football coach and athletic director at Holy Cross University. So he was born Patrick Kenneth O'Donnell, the son of the Holy Cross football coach and athletic director. His dad's name was Cleo O'Donnell. University, it's a Catholic, private Catholic college. He was the head football coach, and he was also the athletic director. So he's very, very well known in the Catholic circles, so to speak, at Holy Cross. Be like Carroll College. Holy Cross be like Carroll College or Notre Dame, only at the lower level. But he was a very famous football coach and athletic director at Holy Cross University. Now, O'Donnell actually legally reversed his names in the 1960s. He went from Patrick Kenneth O'Donnell to Kenneth Patrick O'Donnell. And he did that legally. And he did that in the 1960s. I don't know why, but he did. So he legally reversed his name in the 1960s. And he served our country during World War II a little bit later, but he served in the U.S. Army Air Corps from 1942 to 1945, so he was a military man. He understood that. He served in the U.S. Army Air Corps from 1942 to 1945. And prior to this, he did not know the Kennedys. Didn't have any idea who they were. So he's born the son of a Holy Cross football coach and athletic director, Cleo O'Donnell. He grows up, goes to elementary and high school, so to speak, legally reverses his names in the 1960s, but he does serve our country in the U.S. Army Air Corps from 1942 to 1945. And what did he do after World War II so he could meet the Kennedy